Midi, collègues, invités.
Welcome, colleagues. Thankfully, this afternoon, we will not have any votes in the House. So there will not be any interruptions, and we won't be canceling this meeting. Before starting, I'd like to go through some notes for our witnesses. These are some guidelines, if you will, with regards to
We'll get back to that in a second.
English.
Okay, I think we have it back. Thank you.
Is it back? We have it. On a l'interprétation, c'est bon? Longfield, est-ce que vous pouvez hocher la tête? Parfait.
Perfect. So these are simply some guidelines. They are guidelines for the use of your headsets and your microphones. If we're not careful, you can injure the interpreters through a feedback loop. I'm going to read some of the guidelines. Please keep in mind the preventative measures put in place to protect the health and security of all participants, including interpreters. Only use the black approved earpiece, such as the one that I have on my ear. The former gray earpieces should not be used, but I don't see any here. Please keep your earpiece far away from the microphone at all times. When you are not using your earpiece, place it face down on the sticker that is on the table right in front of you. So there's a small round sticker that you can put the earpiece on face down. That will help with protecting the health of our interpreters. So without further ado, we'll start the first panel. We have with us today from Deloitte, Céline Bach. We have from the Goodman Sustainability Group, Faith Goodman. From Influence Map, we have Dan Van Acker. And from the Montreal Economic Institute, we have Renaud Brossard and Crystal Wittevogel. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Great, thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we'll start with Madame Bach. You have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, ainsi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for giving me the opportunity to appear today. Before beginning, I would like to say that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and I am very grateful for their work as guardian keepers of this land.
Our perspective on how we work with organizations across public and private sectors as they navigate evolving expectations and develop relevant, innovative, and sustainable solutions. Our reputation is built on our credibility, and with more than 175 years of experience as a Canadian firm owned by Canadians, we have grown into who we are today because of the trust that our clients offer us and in our people and in our values. As Canada moves towards achieving a net zero economy, we work with financial institutions to identify sustainable business opportunities and to establish disclosures that inform capital markets in consistent and comparable ways. We're also beginning to work with financial institutions to assist their clients with transition planning. Through our work at Deloitte, we believe collaboration within the financial services industry is key to growing trade and increasing productivity. Many organizations are trying to understand how best to operationalize sustainable finance, and we're here to support them. I'd like to take a moment to present findings from recent original research conducted by Deloitte Canada on how companies making disclosures of their Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions are investing in sustainable capital expenditures and generating sustainable revenues from these investments. These findings establish a positive correlation between disclosures of Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions and greater sustainable investment. Secondly, I'd like to report findings from another stream of research by Deloitte Canada on how global capital markets are valuing the strongest performing companies in terms of GHG intensity compared to their sector peers. We define GHG intensity simply as company Scope 1 and 2 emissions divided by revenue. This stems from a perspective that comparable disclosures and a consensus around the inevitable transition are both informing investors' decisions, resulting in greater investment flowing to the most GHG productive companies globally in several sectors of economic activity. I'd like to relate 2 points from this research. First, our research has found that Canadian companies that are disclosing their GHG emissions are making sustainable capital investments that are 6 times greater than those made by companies that do not disclose GHG emissions. We also found that these capital investments are followed 3 years later with the achievement of close to 6 times higher sustainable revenues than companies that did not disclose GHG emissions. While these findings reflect correlation, not causation, they do tell us that disclosures are associated with much higher sustainable investments that also appear to be productive. Our second stream of research, when considering how public company valuations are explained by financial and non-financial performance, where GHG intensity is the indicator of non-financial performance, GHG intensity explains more than 5% of company value in close to 60% of North American, 46% of European, and 24% of rest of world publicly traded firms. The relationship between better greenhouse GHG intensity, intra-sector performance, and higher valuation of public companies is not yet present in all sectors, but it is the case in a third of sectors in North America and a quarter of sectors in Europe. I'd now like to turn my attention to a potential opportunity. As Deloitte works with public sector and industry associations, we see that these groups are actively considering how shared information platforms might be created to lessen the burden of disclosure and increase comparability to enhance more productive and efficient investments. A one-and-done approach to disclosures, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, is being discussed. Recognizing the significant role of the financial industry as a trusted advisor to Canadian businesses, our research points to immense value from enabling the market transparency that permits benchmarking of GHG intensity, as well as sustainable investment, as part of transition planning. Canadian financial institutions have an opportunity, therefore, to engage with publicly traded companies, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises, to make disclosures as easy and as efficient as possible. This, in turn, will shape macroeconomic and improve public outcomes to the benefit of all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for having me here today.
We'll go now to Ms. Goodman for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair and honourable committee members, thank you for the opportunity to provide additional perspectives regarding the upcoming government study on environment, climate policy impacts related to the Canadian financial system. We all agree that addressing Canada's net zero climate targets will require an economy-wide systems approach that duly expedites action and impact. There's broad consensus that decarbonization investments can be mobilized more effectively if we can unlock a recalibrated approach, one that is risk-balanced for all sizes of businesses and sectors, enabling access to lower cost of capital. This is the engine for growth and competitiveness. In order to drive the next phase of climate and competitiveness progress, we know from leading sustainability thinkers that there are 3 pillars of transition policy: to invest strategically, solve market failures, and make or incent smarter choices. At issue, then, is how. Addressing these financial system issues represents only one of the many puzzle pieces. We would liken it then to considering or offering the opportunity to consider a triple systems challenge with both policy and business implications at the core. One is an opportunity to expand the range and access pathways for financing toolkits, looking at blended financing innovations, that is, engineer solutions that are fit for purpose for all sizes of firms. Two, fast-track a digitized AI and democratized enabled set of solutions that keep pace with or exceed global best practices. And thirdly, reimagine institutional structures enabling frameworks that can play a key role in how institutions maneuver to ably innovate and provide an expanded agenda for this opportunity, looking at environment, economy, and society. In the global race to net zero, we note that the spotlight has largely been on large multinational corporations and how they engineer sustainability and competitiveness. While that is important, and while this federal study will focus on readying the Canadian financial system, let me also suggest the imperative to include a wider lens. We need to open up specific access to decarbonization funding and toolkits that gives due consideration to materially disadvantaged segments of the economy like small and medium enterprise and entrepreneurs. They represent the backbone of supply chains and the engines of growth and competitiveness. In aggregate, their footprint matters. Canada's 1.2 million SMEs represent about 50% of GDP, about 50% of greenhouse gas business emissions. A recent CME study indicated that only 11% of smaller manufacturers have a decarbonization plan. There is no net zero without SME action. SMEs also are increasingly aware that global rules for sustainability are bearing down on all businesses, and everyone needs to get ready. So what do we do about this triple challenge? We would say it needs to be considered all at once via a whole-of-government approach. For example, if we focus in on the SME challenge for a minute, there are immediate experimental opportunities that can be garnered from leading jurisdictions, building in clarity, certainty, a level playing field, and a principled approach. Back to the three-part model I just highlighted, on the issue of financial toolkits, several countries, both in Europe and in Asia, have moved forward over the last several years to implement hugely innovative risk-adjusted tools that are applicable for small and medium business and entrepreneurs. Many countries have digitized ID, digitized credentials, and are more advanced in certain countries, really positioning their small business for global trade. Ample examples from the OECD, from the SME Finance Forum, which is part of the World Bank. And thirdly, reimagining institutional collaborations. Lots of work globally, again, on NFPs, enterprise foundations, benefit corporations, recalibrated public-private partnerships, all with a view to begin to think about fit-for-purpose transition solutions and toolkits that are ready-made for all sizes of business and sectors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have to stop there, but there'll be ample opportunity to share your perspective through answers to questions. We'll go now to Mr. Van Acker for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I'm the program manager for financial research at InfluenceMap, which is a global climate change think tank conducting research into how corporations and financial institutions are affecting climate change. The past few years have seen a significant growth in companies recognizing the importance of climate change and the risks it poses. Most notably, companies are making top-line climate pledges supporting the Paris Agreement. They're publishing climate-related disclosures, and they're setting net zero by 2050 targets. InfluenceMap's research seeks to hold companies accountable to these commitments, in line with the UN's guidance on the net zero commitments of non-state entities. The financial sector is no exception to the net zero target trend, with a wide range of climate alliances being created with significant membership within the sector. Among these is the Net Zero Banking Alliance, a group of leading global banks committed to financing ambitious climate action to transition the real economy to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Canada's largest 5 banks, RBC, TD Bank, Scotiabank, BMO, and CIBC, also called the Big Five, are all members of this alliance. And as such, they have committed explicitly to transition the attributable greenhouse gas emissions from their lending and investment activities to align with a net zero by 2050 pathway. InfluenceMap published research in March of this year that assessed the climate-relevant activities of the Big Five and to what extent these are aligned with their own climate commitments. We found that Canada's largest banks are substantially off track to meet their own net zero targets. This is primarily explained by their lack of science-aligned transition policies, their increased financing of fossil fuel companies and low financing of green companies, and their opposition to climate-related policy. While the Big Five banks have all set policies to reduce the emissions linked to their financing activities, we found these to be severely lacking in ambition to be credibly aligned with net zero by 2050. In practice, the bank's policies continue to allow financing to drive increased emissions in climate-critical sectors, such as the energy and power sectors. Meanwhile, Canadian banks far underperform the largest European and US banks when it comes to setting policies to phase out the financing of coal, oil, and gas in alignment with the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's science-based pathways. As a result of these policies, or rather the lack thereof, in 2022, the proportion of fossil fuel companies in the Big Five's financing deal value was almost 3 times that of leading US and European banks. In fact, from 2020 to 2022, the Big Five banks increased their average lending exposure to fossil fuel companies, while their largest US and European counterparts decreased their financing to the sector. The Big Five also provided 3.9 times less deal flow to green companies than to fossil fuel companies over this 2020 to 2022 period. This ratio is again significantly higher than the largest US and European banks, which on average respectively financed 2.8 and 2.0 times less to green companies than fossil fuels. As part of their Net Zero Banking Alliance membership, the banks have emphasized the importance of a public policy framework to guide the transition. Each of the Big Five banks has committed to, quote, engage on public policies to help support a net zero transition of economic sectors in line with science, end quote. Our analysis finds that none of the banks have publicly advocated for ambitious climate-related policy in Canada. In fact, the banks are primarily represented in financial policy matters by the Canadian Bankers Association, which emphasizes that Canada does not require climate-related financial regulation and that the transition should be dictated by the real economy. Meanwhile, all 5 banks are members of industry associations blocking climate policy in the real economy, both in Canada and globally. These include the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council of Canada, which have also advocated for the expansion of Canadian fossil fuel production. In closing, despite claiming to recognize the importance of banks' role in the transition, it is clear that Canada's Big Five banks have taken little voluntary action to achieve their own climate commitments in the absence of climate-related financial regulation. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Van Acker. Et pour l'Institut économique de...
Thank you, Mr. Van Acker. And on behalf of the Montreal Economic Institute, Mr. Brossard, will you be giving the opening remarks or will you split your time? I'm going to make the opening remarks, but Ms. Wood-Vrongel and I will split our time during the committee. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. We will be talking about a very important issue today. At the Montreal Economic Institute, we are big fans of Frédéric Bassin, a French thinker. He said that the good economist...
Order?
Excuse me. There's no translation
Okay.
in English.
Testing the English. We were trying the English. Do you hear me in English, Mr. Ali? Can you hear me in English on the English channel? Yes.
Alors, continuez.
Please continue, Mr. Brossard. From where I was? Okay. What distinguishes a good economist from a bad one is that one looks at the visible impacts of policies, and the other one looks at what is predictable. Currently, what's visible is insurance companies and banks and so on. What we don't see are the consequences on SMEs. Today, we are speaking to you to remind you not to forget the SMEs. In the financial sector, there's a lot of pressure on consultants, and there are obligatory disclosures on environmental topics. There are various reports. One of the reports talks about 3 different kinds of emissions. Let's take the example of an aerospace manufacturer in Mirabel. They will measure the impact of their own production, which is the first stage. And then there are things like electricity, heating, air conditioning. That means that this company will ask Hydro-Quebec what the carbon intensity is for their electricity production. That is the level 2. Then the manufacturer must calculate and present the emissions of the entire company. That means the supplier and the consumer and the elimination of the product. So they have to include all of the emissions from the mine to the recycling process at the end of the product's life, and that is the 3rd level, or scope 3. Other sources may be more sources might be more obvious in scope 1 and scope 2, but there's also a question of cost and complexity. The BSIF it's estimated that it can cost up to $640 million to take these emissions into account just for the first year of a company. SMEs don't have that kind of money in order to pay environmental consultants. Of course, this would mean that hundreds of SMEs would be impacted, and some would be impacted indirectly. Let's take the manufacturer of airplane parts as well. Their cost is what determines their competitiveness, for example. They then must ask for costs from their own suppliers. SMEs are not directly targeted by these policies, but they are affected because they need big companies to be part of their clientele. We recommend that you take them into consideration when regulating because they are disproportionately impacted by such policies. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We will let Mr. Deltel start the first round with 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to see you today, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. We all acknowledge that climate change has real impacts, and we all must do our part to reduce pollution and emissions in order to ensure that we leave a better planet to our children. We all have different ideas of how we should do that. First, I'd like to ask Ms. Back some questions. I hope I can speak to you in French, and I did hear you speak French at the very beginning. Ms. Back, you mentioned that companies who disclose are 6 times more successful and have make more profits than others that don't disclose. I was wondering how you came to that number. Are you looking at any company whatsoever, or are you putting them in different categories? Because there are some companies that maybe are more technologically, that make various technologies or are not the same kind of companies that deal with other environmental things. Thank you for the question. There's a database that includes all of the economy's various industries. We have data on sustainable investments. In those sectors, we consider that sustainable investments from companies that disclose their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are 6 times higher than the investments that don't disclose their emissions from Scope 1 and Scope 2. So are we comparing apples and apples here? Yes, indeed. Both globally and in Canada. How do you calculate the emissions? And let me explain. We know that there's a productivity issue. If a company increases its productivity and its efficiency, they can also reduce their environmental footprint. So, for example, if you are able to reduce, Are you producing 2 times? How do you calculate the efficiency and the carbon footprint of a company? In the second part of our research, we looked at the emissions divided by revenue. So it's normalized according to the sector, and I think that answers your question. Carbon efficiency across the economic activities of the company are what's taken into consideration. Now I have a question for Mr. Renaud Brassard from the Montreal Economic Institute. As you know, since your institute is in Quebec, the Haute Étude Commerciale in Quebec revealed that 19 million liters of petroleum were consumed, which was a 7% increase. So we do have to keep producing petroleum. If we ask banks to no longer support the Canada energy sector, what will happen to our producers who are fueling these 19 million liters of petroleum that are oil and gas that are used by Quebecers? What will happen when banks are invited to stop funding these businesses? Thank you for the question. Here's what might happen. Their funding fees might increase because they will be deprived of certain stable funding. Here's what might happen to Canadian companies, or with regards to the consumption of Canadian oil and gas. There might not be any change at all. The fact that oil and gas is produced here or elsewhere doesn't change anything. People still need to go to work. They still need to put gas in their cars. This is the kind of policy that has a lot of economic pain for little environmental gain. And of course, in Quebec, there's been an increase in oil and gas consumption over the last year, and this is oil and gas that citizens need. I have another question. There's mandatory disclosure and disclosure that is optional. What is your opinion? We think that if companies are ready to disclose the data on their own accord, then that's an advantage, and that's all for the best. We have an issue with mandatory disclosure that can be very costly, and as we explained in our introduction, the costs will be burdened by the companies that are disclosing. We know that productivity is struggling in Canada. And if we compare with the United States and with the Securities Exchange Commission, they did some research on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. They said that Scope 1 and Scope 2 must be disclosed, but they were not ready to make it mandatory. Thank you very much. We must go on to Ms. Châtel now. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here on the. This is a very important study. We've already had a few meetings at this committee. So we've learned that Canada is lagging. We have to do more if we want to remain competitive. And this is why I'm very interested by your study, Ms. Beck. It reveals that investing in disclosure and transparency with regards to our investors, Canadian companies who choose to disclose will increase their revenues. Can you expand on that? Is that true across all sectors? I thought it was very interesting, this data that you produced. The analysis that we've done is across all companies in Canada that we can isolate the sustainable capital investments. And those who also disclose were 6 times more successful in 2019 than the companies that didn't disclose their emissions. 3 years later, after those investments, those same companies had sustainable revenues that were almost 6 times higher than the companies who had not disclosed the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So, if I understand correctly, it means that the Canadian government, should it go ahead with its taxonomy and the mandatory disclosure, then we will be going towards economic growth. We will be stimulating the economy and the growth of our companies. Of course, it's not a guarantee. It's a political decision, and governments must take their positions. Our research provides us with a certain perspective, which suggests that companies that do disclose their emissions have the opportunity to compare themselves with their peers, of course, with regards to the emissions, but also to compare their proportion of capital investments destined to the growth of the sustainable quality of their company. A witness earlier said that SMEs are part of supply changes across the world. When a company discloses its emissions, you can compare yourself to other companies with regards to your emissions, and then your management team can look at what kind of investments they want to make to go look for markets that are profitable. So this is a disclosure cycle, one of making decisions, one of making investments that can, of course, lead to more investments. Thank you. I understand that there's a cost for companies to disclose, but there's also a cost to inaction, and that might be the loss of investments and of business opportunities. Indeed, it's very important to look at the entire picture. With regards to SMEs, Ms. Goodman, you talked about the importance of taking SMEs into consideration. Another witness also talked about that earlier. You talked about the OECD data, and you gave other examples as well. Of course, we are not the only country who is aiming for a green transition. Other countries are also making that progress on that front. And so I think we should adopt best practices. Can you tell us what the best practices are to support SMEs during this transition so that they don't miss out on business opportunities?
I think, as some of the other panelists mentioned, the global rules for sustainability are bearing down on supply chains. So, as everyone knows, the EU has tabled its frameworks and models. And so, for SMEs that are part of global supply chains, the idea of disclosures, of sustainable investing and getting ready is a fait accompli. It's here. And as was mentioned by some of the other panelists, it's about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And the point I was making was that SMEs make up such a very significant material portion of Canada's GDP and their, in aggregate, contribution to greenhouse gases, so close to 50% of business greenhouse gases. We have to find solutions that are fit for purpose for all sizes
We'll
of
have
firms.
to stop there and go to Madame Posey.
Merci à tous nos témoins d'être.
Thank you to all the witnesses. Ms. Buck, I'd like to ask you a question. Can you tell us quickly, because we don't have much time, what the best practices are internationally that Canada can use, whether it's legislative or regulatory? Just a few of the best practices that we don't seem to be putting in place. I was listening to Mr. Acker earlier, and I got the feeling that we are not following suit. So with regards to the result of our research, it's provided us with a certain perspective. Disclosures are associated with a higher tendency to invest. Performance, with regards to carbon emission intensity in many sectors, is now associated with a better valuing of capital gain markets. Policies that can support both of those conditions are policies that exist in various countries, and the government can learn more about such policies. What can you tell us about the importance of predictability of rules and regulations? I think this is something that's very important for a company, and can you tell us more about the positive impact of predictability as the policies are put in place? Predictability is, of course, very important in this very complex sector. Here's what we've observed in our research. In some sectors, for a while, there's been some regulation, and those are sectors where the companies who have the better performance with regards to carbon intensity and emissions have a better value as well. Mr. Van Acker, earlier you had a pretty pessimistic perspective of what Canada is not doing compared to other companies, specifically Canadian banks. In your report from 2024 from Influence Map, which I've understood is a very credible company, you've titled it Canada's Big Five Banks Aiming for Net Zero. You've said that credible strategies for the climate are not able to be implemented by the banks. For the committee's benefit, can you illustrate the different ways Canadian banks have chosen to implement their products and their policies?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So we've seen some level of integration of climate factors into the bank's disclosure and their top-line processes. This is in parallel with these top-line net zero commitments that they've set. However, this seems to be relatively limited to setting high-level board and management oversight and disclosing some risk management practices. However, we're not really seeing this carrying through when it comes to having concrete metrics and transition plans that would credibly align the bank's activities with net zero. And then going even further into the actual financial activities, well, I think I described those in detail earlier. There we see a big level of misalignment with how the banks are financing the economy and a potential net zero by 2050 pathway. And the Canadian banks really underperform their US and European peers in this regard.
Je m'excuse, monsieur, les derniers mots, j'ai pas...
I did not hear your last words. Can you just repeat?
I said that in terms of when we look at the actual financing activities, so truly the lending and the investment activities of the banks, no, there we're not seeing the level of climate ambition that we would expect in comparison to their own top-line commitments, and they're really underperforming compared to their international counterparts who have set similar commitments.
Donc, si je comprends bien...
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, banks have commitments, and they have climate commitments, but they are not credible because they're not able to implement those commitments. Is it because of a lack of transparency? What's behind this?
So from the side of there's a transparency question here. Certainly, having increased transparency within the economy on the corporate side can aid in driving, green and transition financing. However, there also seems to be kind of traditional or continued action by the banks, kind of continuing their existing relationships with problematic industries and financing polluting companies. And in that sense, we're seeing other banks, even in regions where we have similar, levels of transparency in the economy, financing more green companies and transitionary companies alongside their continued activities.
Thank you. We'll go now to Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Ms. Back, and following up on a question from my colleague from the bloc, you talked a little bit about consistency and predictability. Can you talk about how legislative and regulatory measures can help companies who might be hesitant pull the trigger when it comes to ESG policies?
So this is an evolving space, and I think it is a complex one for companies to sort of navigate. There is, I believe, an important consideration for any company, and that is what their competitors and peers are doing. And once the CEO or the board or the management team of a company sees that there is a certain practice being adopted by peers, it is relevant, right? And so that may happen by regions or by sectors or by other types of dimensions as well.
Thank you. And my next question is for Mr. Van Acker. And you painted a kind of bleak picture of the gap between the net zero pledges of Canada's biggest banks and their progress towards meeting their goals. I'm curious, when we think about what elected officials and governments can do to get the biggest banks on track, what's the role of climate transition plans, and what steps would we need to take to make sure that those kind of strategies or others are implemented?
It's a great question, obviously a critical question for governments. I'll preface by saying that our expertise is mainly on the financial research side. I'm not as much a policy expert, but based on what we're seeing globally, obviously transition plans are key, and governments can play a critical role in helping to guide the financial sector, and that includes banks to align their financing with net zero and as such facilitate that activity in the real economy. A key part of that is increased transparency and disclosure, defining what sustainable activities are and aren't, and how corporations and the financial sector are aiding to finance that activity. And so that can be a key role that governments can play in aiding transition plans.
Thanks. I was also interested in some of what you were talking about when you were discussing the lobbying of the biggest banks and what organizations they're taking part in, what lobbying they are doing or aren't doing. Can you talk or expand a little bit more about the lobbying that's been taking place, the political advocacy from Canada's biggest banks, and how this behavior might undermine those pledges to net zero?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, within the financial sector, we see less direct lobbying by financial institutions. What I mean by that is they are not as much themselves interacting with policy. Rather, they seem to rely on industry associations more and more to do this on their behalf. And the Canadian banks are no exception to this. For example, both the financial and real economy industry associations that I mentioned. So while the banks themselves state that they would support a public policy framework to guide the transition and that this is essential, their lobbying seems to undermine that and blocking and diluting climate policy both in the real economy and when it comes to financial regulation is obviously not aligned with the net zero by 2050 pathway.
And, it seems like the things that you just said about the biggest banks could also be said about the biggest oil and gas companies in Canada. We're seeing those organizations lobby themselves, but really rely on industry organizations to do a lot of their lobbying for them. They publicly might say they support a transition to a sustainable economy, but then actively engage their industry organizations in lobbying against those kinds of policies. And we also see that the people involved at the top of these organizations, the biggest banks and the biggest oil and gas companies, are often interchangeable. They move from company to company. Can you talk a little bit about the interaction between the biggest oil companies and the biggest banks in Canada?
Yeah, sure. This is a particularly relevant question in Canada. Based on our report, the figures I cited, where the Canadian banks' exposure to fossil fuels in their lending activities is so much higher than in many of the other economies that we analyze. Obviously Canada has a significant fossil fuel sector, and a significant portion of that lending that we're seeing, this high proportion going to fossil fuel companies, is specifically to domestic Canadian oil and gas companies. So it does seem that there are significant links between the Canadian banking sector and the fossil fuel sector.
And I wonder about the kind of conflict of interest that has. If the folks at the top of the biggest banks in Canada are using industry organizations, how many seconds do I have left? About 30. Okay. Are using industry organizations to undermine climate policy, have these deep interconnected ties to oil and gas. What kind of advice might you give to policymakers to address this issue?
That would be brief advice, but
I think in general, my advice would be for increased transparency and disclosure around lobbying in general. Connections to industry associations, alignment with positions. Yeah.
Merci. Alors, on va demander à M. Cram de lancer le deuxième tour. Et là, je vais...
So we'll ask Mr. Cram to start the second round. So each party will have 4 minutes, and Ms. Collins and Ms. Posey will have 2 minutes each.
Let's start with Ms. Goodman, because I believe you were the first one to bring up small and medium-sized businesses. Is there currently a federal government program to provide rebates on the carbon tax to incentivize small businesses to make their businesses less emissions intensive?
I think there's a whole range of federal government programs and certainly a range of tools that exist. And also, as everyone knows, for SMEs, there are crown corporations like EDC and BDC that also have a range of programs. I think the point that I was really raising at the heart of the matter is that as we think about transition financing and climate policy and this balanced approach for economy, environment, and society, that SMEs don't get left behind. In aggregate, their footprint matters, and in aggregate, from a GDP standpoint, really, really matters. And so I think as we look at what other countries are doing, in particular for SMEs, their institutions, their toolkits, their digitization, these are important considerations for us. So, I think as we think about policy development, policy implementation, I was honing in on experimenting. What are other countries doing? What lessons learned are there for Canada? And that we don't need to wait, that there's a lot that we can do. And tangentially, I also mentioned the SME Finance Forum, which is part of the World Bank. They've done tremendous global studies on access to finance, access to markets, access to skills, enabling environments. Very concrete ideas on what can be done now. So there's an opportunity for the federal government and for provincial governments to work cohesively on this SME challenge, and it is material.
Do you have any specific recommendations for changes to existing federal government programs with respect to the carbon tax and with respect to your green initiatives for SMEs?
I think one of the big opportunities for all governments is looking at what jurisdictional best practices are relating to access to financing. So as we talk about transition policy, and we look at this huge cohort of SMEs and entrepreneurs who need to think about the global rules bearing down on them, so supply chain sustainability rules. Competitiveness matters. So to be competitive, you're going to look at your peers and you're going to need financing. And as we all know, access to low-cost financing is a competitive advantage. So that is a very important area for us to think about. And as SMEs over the last few years have moved more into the sustainability agenda, they cite, as I said, resources, access to talent, access to time, access to funding as a big impediment. So that would be a spotlight area I would recommend.
Thank you. Let's go to Mr. Van Acker now. Mr. Van Acker, you talked about how the big five banks in Canada are still financing coal and oil and gas companies, presumably because these are profitable ventures. So I was wondering if the big five banks were to stop financing oil and gas and coal companies, what would be the impacts to them in terms of lost profits and lost revenue?
10 seconds.
No.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we don't recommend that they stop financing immediately. We simply recommend that they align their phase out, as many banks are doing,
Thank you,
with science-based pathways.
Mr. Longfield, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. In the brief amount of time we have, I want to start with Ms. Goodman. As a former SME myself, I had to report environmental information back to my board of directors. I was managing director of a Canadian division of a UK company, and we had to report on energy conservation that we were doing, water treatment, waste stream management, in order to make us more competitive globally, but also, as you said, to be part of a supply chain that needed us to show that we were doing these activities. I'm wondering how policy-wise we could enact something where SMEs would have to do surveys similar to the ones I was doing for my UK head office. Would that be through Stats Canada?
One of the jurisdictional lessons learned is that in leading countries, there are opportunities for frameworks, SME frameworks, that can guide what an SME needs to report on, and again, voluntary. But if an SME is not part of a supply chain, there are voluntary opportunities. I think what's important, maybe underpinning also the theme of your question, is as global rules do become clear, and even in the case of Canada, we've got the ISSB and then the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board rules unfolding. Scope 3 is in front of us. And so as SMEs look at what they need to do, getting ahead of this and planning their investment horizon and accessing capital will be a very important consideration.
Thank you. And you talked about certainty. And, when we see politically the Conservatives saying they want to axe the carbon tax and what that could have as an impact on businesses that are trying to compete globally in a market that's asking for evidence of going towards net zero. There's a conflict there. Could you comment on that?
I think, as I alluded to in my original comments, when SMEs think about competitiveness, it's often global competitiveness and the linkages to the supply chains in which they operate. So I think the way that I would look at this issue is to say, what is the, what's the roadmap for access to financing, access to markets, access to skills and knowledge, and an enabling environment, a digitized environment. And I think all those levers together roll up to how SMEs are eventually going to have to participate in moving this agenda forward. So I think it's a complicated issue, but my preliminary comments really honed in on we can't forget about SMEs. They're an important cohort.
Yeah. Absolutely, and thank you for that. Ms. Back, over to you. I think of quality management systems when the ISO 9000 was introduced in ISO 9001 and 14,000. Businesses looked at that as a cost, but ultimately saw that there was a financial benefit as well as supply chain benefit. Is there a parallel situation here in terms of accountability and transparency in carbon markets?
You have 20 seconds.
So our research suggests that there is, and that the number of sectors where the capital markets are rewarding greater GHG productivity is already substantial, and it could be that will grow over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Oui, alors, la question...
Ms. Posey, for 2 minutes. Here's the question I'd like to ask for the 3 witnesses here that are in the room. When we started this study, I already pointed out that Canada is lagging vis-a-vis compared to other jurisdictions. Things have gone well in Europe, and we know that Europe is a federal entity in some ways. What is the risk for Canada if a regime or a robust regime is not possible anytime soon?
Yeah, so climate change risk has significant financial risk, be it transition or physical, for the financial sector. So if the Canadian system does not adjust and falls behind other economies in adjusting to this transition risk, we could certainly see there being significant financial costs associated with that.
So our research suggests that the cost of capital for companies that are performing better than their peers is lower because their valuations are higher. Therefore, if further delays occur, it's possible that the cost of capital for Canadian companies that are not leaders would increase.
So certainty and clarity for the cohort I was talking about earlier, SMEs, is important. A level playing field and a fit-for-purpose set of solutions. But I also referenced that it's more than that. It's also the institutions that govern the policies and the implementation, how we experiment, how we leverage global jurisdictional best practices and bring them here. So competitiveness matters, access to low-cost capital matters, but it's a lot more than just financing. And I also mentioned digitization and AI, huge enablers.
Yeah. Ms. Collins, 2 minutes.
Maybe just Ms. Goodman, if you want to take another 15 seconds, certification AI, if you wanted to finish your thought.
Digitization?
Okay, yeah.
Yes. So I was mentioning the work of an entity called the SME Finance Forum, which is part of the World Bank, just as one of many. They've done some really great work on understanding globally which jurisdictions are ahead on how they've helped key segments of the economy, for example, SMEs, countries that have moved quickly on digitization and certification. And there really is a link between smart policy, the digital environment, and the institutions, the public-private partnerships that also enable it. And I mentioned the word puzzle piece in my earlier remarks. It really is a lot more than just the financing piece. It's all of the above.
Thanks. I'm curious about the difference between certifications by nonprofits, things like a B Corp certification, compared to rules and standards set by the government. And maybe first to Ms. Back and then to Ms. Goodman, if you have answers about either of those things.
Certifications. It isn't an area. This isn't an area that I'm an expert on, so I'm going to pass on that one.
Thank you. I think in the earlier question that you asked me, we were talking about digital certification, in other words, as distinct and apart from a benchmark. So are benchmarks important? Ultimately, absolutely, because they enable any SME or any company to know how they fare against their competitors. You asked about B Corp and other models. I think there's a plethora of models globally. And, you know, when I referenced fit for purpose, what I was really drilling down on is for a variety of benchmarks, accreditations,
Thank you.
certifications.
We're going to have to stop there.
It depends.
Yeah.
The
We're going to have to
sector
go to Mr.
and the
Leslie
size
now.
of the
We're going to
firm.
have to go to Mr. Leslie for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Mr. Brassard. In a paper written by your institute, it stated that if businesses have to disclose ESG information or sustainability reports, it would artificially create winners and losers. And it went on to say that many entities lack sufficient resources to be able to fully comply, especially small and medium-sized enterprises. And in your opening remarks, you also mentioned that the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission estimates that a similar disclosure proposal in the United States would cost between $490,000 and $640,000 US dollars for the first year of compliance, although some believe those costs may actually be substantially higher. Could you please outline for us, with as much precision as you can, what these costs actually are, how they are downloaded to the business, whether they will stay with that business, or whether they will be passed on to customers and consumers?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. In terms of what those costs are, a lot of it is going to be consultants, and a lot of it is going to be time. Consultants, because not a lot of small businesses have the expertise in-house to be able to do that sort of accounting. So they will need to hire some consultants to be able to walk them through those different steps, and then they'll need to have some proper measuring of their processes put in place, so that in the future they will know roughly what every activity emits in terms of emissions. So essentially, consulting fees. And then, sorry, I'm not remembering the second part of your question. If you can remind.
Sure.
Remind
it
me.
was just whether or not that business will eat the entirety of those costs, or if you can anticipate that they would be passed down onto their customers further down the supply chain and/or directly to consumers.
Oh, quite simply, with any cost that's imposed on a business, a significant part of it gets passed on to consumers. Part of it gets passed on, of course, to the owners of business, get a little bit less profit, but usually they find a way to jack up prices so that it can then be passed on to consumers.
Now, you mentioned consultants, and I've heard the conversation around the table today regarding SMEs, many of which do operate on a global scale, or at least a North American scale, many of which also they might make the thing sitting in front of me here, and it might be entirely domestic. They may be a very legitimately small enterprise. You mentioned the capacity limitations, but it seems as though this is largely just a cottage industry of consultants that are putting together ways to audit things that really ultimately, to me, it's very nebulous as to whether it will reduce emissions. Do you feel that this is a pathway to actually reducing emissions in any significant way?
I don't think it's a pathway to actually reducing emissions in any significant way, other than by imposing undue costs on small businesses and having enough of them shut down. The fact is, when businesses were consulted about this, a lot of small businesses said that this is not something that should apply to them. Of course, the consultants that would be in charge of making those reports are typically very much in favor of getting extra business. In and of itself, voluntary disclosure of the different scopes of emissions is not a bad thing at all. It can be a good thing. That's why some businesses choose to do it. But mandatory disclosure would be very, very costly for the many small businesses that would be subject to it, or that would be in the supply chains of other businesses that are subject to it.
So would you say it's fair to state that, sure, voluntary disclosure is a good thing, perhaps a competitive advantage, but mandating them across the board for all SMEs, large companies, is more of a cost than it is a benefit to Canada?
A very brief answer.
Absolutely.
Okay. Take us to the end of this panel.
Great. Thank you so
I
much.
caught myself there.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the necessity of disclosures and whether companies should disclose or not, but it seems to me that that horse has left the barn. Like, it's necessary to have disclosures, to have this, the clarity, the certainty that our companies need for many reasons. Every one of the witnesses had alluded to different things. The cost of capital increases if you don't have disclosures. Markets might disappear, especially if part of your supply chain. And profitability, returns might be lower. So it seems to me that the conversation is really about how do we help companies to, to efficiently and in a way that doesn't overburden them actually meet these requirements. And so I wanted to ask you, Ms. Goodman, about you talked about some of the best practices that come from one of the World Bank forums on this, on small and medium enterprises. But do you have any examples of toolkits or the use of AI or digitization that will help these small and medium enterprises to disclose their emissions and to go in the right direction?
I think as global rules unfold, and as I said, supply chains increasingly will need to deliver on sustainability, the E, the S, the G. It's already here. Certainly the EU is leading that agenda. There's key pieces of I'll use the SME example, a key piece of their mindset that we need to think about as we think about policy. So the first one is, absolutely, are they aware that it's a competitive advantage for them to participate? Do they have the skills, the knowledge, and the expertise to begin the journey? How do they carbon count? How do they carbon count remotely? How do they build their ESG roadmap that would fulfill the obligation of the supply chain globally that they're in? And once they've built their ESG roadmap, how do they build their pro forma and decide on what the decarbonization technology is? And then where do they get the capital? What is the price of that capital? If they don't have a good asset base or a historical revenue stream, the bank might not give it to them. So what are the mechanisms? So when I talked about the work of the OECD and the SME Finance Forum, what I was really talking about is the opening up of options and toolkits around that entire spectrum. And we were talking earlier about benchmarks.
Ms. Goodman, I only have a couple minutes, I know, and I don't interrupt, but that's really great advice, and I know where we can go with that. So perhaps we can follow up on that. The second part I wanted to talk about was a comment that a member opposite Mr. Daltel made regarding the use of fossil fuels in Quebec and the fact that it's increasing, and if our banks don't fund the fossil fuel companies, you know, we're going to have to import more fossil fuels from other countries. And I'm wondering, with the border adjustments that are happening now and the need for obviously a decline in the use of fossil fuels as the financing globally is restricted, whether the price on pollution program that we have in Canada is not necessary to have in conjunction with sustainable finance, so that at the same time that the capital is restricted, demand is also going down for the fossil fuels, so we don't have this kind of disconnect at the end where as was described. Can anyone comment on what you think of that, of how those work together?
I'm not going to comment specifically on that. It's not my area of expertise, but I think all of us alluded to the idea of clarity, certainty, and level playing field. And it is a globally competitive environment for all sizes of firms. And so I think this idea of whatever the forward policies are, that it does provide all sizes of business with certainty, clarity, transparency, a level playing field that's fit for purpose.
Merci à nos témoins.
Thank you to our witnesses. This ends our first panel. We're going to take a short break, and thank you to the witnesses for sharing your experience, and to the members for their excellent questions. We're going to suspend for a moment just to welcome the second panel.
Bienvenue à nos panélistes pour cette deuxième moitié de la séance. Nous avons avec nous
Thank you. We're happy to welcome the next set of panelists, Senator Rosa Galvez, and she has a bill
which is on the topic of our study, and she has tabled this bill at the Senate. Senator Galvez, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, it is an honor for me to be here today and to exchange with you on the environment and climate impacts related to the Canadian financial system. As you know, climate change is accelerating at an alarming rate and is already having a devastating impact on Canada's economy and financial stability. As the financiers of Canada's economic activities, financial institutions are on the front line of climate risk. The insurance sector, for example, is particularly vulnerable, yet continues to finance fossil fuels. Canadian pension plans have increased their foreign investments, namely in clean energy, while domestic investment stagnates. Meanwhile, from 2020 to 2022, the big five Canadian banks increased their fossil fuel financing exposure from 15.5% to 18.4%, more than double the exposure of their European and U.S. counterparts. At the same time, risky investments in fossil fuels made by our financial institutions pose an obvious risk to the global climate and further fuel the climate crisis. The consideration of both the impacts of climate change on our financial institutions and the impacts of our financial institutions on climate change is coined double materiality. I encourage this committee to explore the concept in the context of its study. While Canadian banks have committed to net zero by 2050, a recent report shows that the big five banks favor fossil fuel investments over clean energy at a ratio of 3.9 to 1. In contrast, global energy investment in 2023 favored clean energy over fossil fuels at a ratio of 1.7 to 1. Canada is at odds with global trends. The Government of Canada has provided over $18.55 billion in public financial support to fossil fuel companies in 2023. This is a direct contradiction of its climate commitments, but also against a healthy and vibrant market. Even with net zero pledges, Canadian public and private financial institutions are increasing their support of fossil fuels. Relying on voluntary measures will not help us achieve our goals. In fact, they are unreliable and constantly at risk of backsliding, as was demonstrated by BMO, which recently revoked its anti-coal lending policies to satisfy the political ideology of the state of West Virginia. We need to assume our parliamentary responsibility in designing a financial system that aligns with public interest and, through legislation, provide a level playing field for all financial institutions in the transition to a low-carbon economy.
A proposition with Bill S-243, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, or CAFA for short, introduced in the Senate in 2022, and currently being studied by the Senate Committee on Banking. Maybe some actions proposed in CAFA might help inspire your committee study. CAFA will establish a duty for directors of financial institutions and major crown corporations to align with climate commitments. In 2019, the expert panel on sustainable finance recommended that the Canadian government clarify the fiduciary duty that does not preclude the consideration of relevant climate change factor and that international best practice increasingly require such consideration. Through annual reporting requirement, CAFA will compel federally regulated corporations, financial institutions, and major crown corporations to set the developed and much needed action plans and transition plans progress report. CAFA will align market supervisions by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions with climate commitments. It will consider the need for capital adequacy requirements that are proportional to the macroprudential climate risk generated by financial institutions. it will require the appointment of at least one individual with climate expertise to the boards of crown corporations, as well as prevent conflict of interest associated with the appointment of individuals who have private interests linked to fossil fuel companies. Today, 7 out of Canada's 11 largest pension funds have at least one board member who simultaneously serves as a director or executive of a fossil fuel company. CAFA will require the publication of a government action plan to help align financial products with climate commitments. Mr.
Sorry,
Chair.
Senator, we're going to have to stop there.
Yes, thank you. Merci.
Thank you. There'll be opportunities to elaborate. We have now Professor Pardee, Bruce Pardee from Queen's University. Professor Pardee, you have 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If your objective was to prevent Canadian businesses from succeeding in the global economy, how would you do it? Here are some ideas. You could impose taxes on your businesses and consumers of a type that other nations do not have. You could create regulatory barriers that prevent projects from being built, while other countries with rich natural resources and terrible environmental records beat us to the punch. And while you're at it, you could sign on to international obligations that these other countries do not share. And finally, you could find a way to starve your primary industries of capital. And that's the idea that you are exploring here. You seem to be studying how to turn banks and other financial institutions, pensions, and ultimately Canadian businesses themselves into climate agencies, to require them to disclose climate risks like OSCE wants them to do, to make banks impose climate standards on their customers, to have pensions divest their funds from climate laggards, and to limit or deny credit to companies based upon their compliance with government priorities. These are terrible ideas. If you really wanted to reduce global carbon emissions, here are the first 2 things you could do. 1, unleash Canadian natural gas. Permit it to be developed, produced, exported without onerous regulation, red tape, carbon taxes, and endless environmental assessment. Canadian natural gas could displace massive amounts of coal in China, India, and numerous other countries that produce most of the carbon emissions on this planet. Number 2, you could unleash nuclear energy. Unlike solar power and wind power, nuclear power is an actual substitute for fossil fuels for generating electricity. It can produce base load, which solar and wind cannot do. You could do these things while enhancing Canadian prosperity. Instead, you seek to control and direct financial markets and the economy itself. Free market economies are not managed. We don't really have free markets in this country. Instead, bureaucracies insert themselves into every facet of economic activity. Managerial governments seek to compel their preferred outcomes. That doesn't work. Businesses don't need to be told to pay attention to risk. That's what business does. Competing in a commercial marketplace is the definition of risk. Publicly listed companies already have obligations to disclose material risks to their business. For most businesses, the biggest climate risk is not physical or environmental, but governmental. It is the risk from changing regulatory demands that shift the legal ground beneath their feet. You represent their biggest risk. Other natural resource countries are eating our lunch. Foreign investment is leaving, per capita GDP is falling, productivity is in the tank, Canadians are becoming poor. Canadian prosperity is easily lost. We are seeing just how easy it can be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Right on time at 5 minutes. We'll go now to research professor Ellen Quigley at the University of Cambridge. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ellen Quigley. I'm a research professor and special advisor to the Chief Financial Officer at the University of Cambridge, but I speak in a private capacity as an academic today. It is after 10 p.m. my time as I speak, but it is well worth working late to have a chance to speak with you. I have one central message to share with you today, which is that we are behind, but we have the opportunity to lead. I'll start with how we're behind. As a country, our emissions are still rising, while wealthy country peers, including the US, have seen significant decreases in recent years. Our major banks are substantially more exposed to fossil fuel financing compared to international peers, as has been mentioned, with figures ranging from 14% to 23% of total balance sheet exposure, these are eye-popping figures that regulators should already be concerned about. These numbers may be so high precisely because global banks and investors have already pulled out of Canada's oil and gas sector, Barclays and HSBC being two of the most salient examples, rendering it increasingly a provincial industry, quite literally, that is heavily concentrated in our own domestic financial institutions. We should be asking ourselves why investors from other countries consider our reserves too risky and what level of concentrated risk we're willing to be left with. On top of that, we face serious reputational harm on the international stage. And I have to say, I'm now embarrassed to be a Canadian working abroad, where we are increasingly, and I'm afraid justifiably, seen as a global pariah in climate terms. Our negative climate impact is disproportionate and rising, but so is the financial risk to our country as a result. Our most significant increases in emissions come from oil and gas, and our oil and gas is relatively expensive and emissions intensive and largely for export. So that makes us vulnerable. Two peer-reviewed academic papers from former Cambridge colleague Mercure and co-authors find that Canada is particularly exposed to stranded asset risk by global standards, especially on a per capita basis. But as someone who was born and raised on the prairies, I also worry about stranded workers and communities if we continue with fossil fuel expansion at this stage. These risks continue to rise without our ability even to account for them because we don't yet have the necessary legislation and regulation in place to do so. However, we have before us CAFA, which would allow us to leapfrog other jurisdictions and become the global leader in climate finance. CAFA is both consistent with other jurisdictions' requirements, which will increasingly be necessary anyway, especially as EU regulation extends to a border adjustment mechanism and other interjurisdictional measures, while also going a step further to maintain and enhance Canada's reputation as a steady hand in this area. We're known for being a particularly skilled regulator of the banking system, and we are also the envy of the world when it comes to pension fund governance, and CAFA would simply add to the perception that the world should look to Canada for financial sector legislation and regulation. Yeah, I mean, that's right. This legislation is going to make us look prescient to global observers in future years because it recognizes climate as a systemic risk that must be attended to at a macroprudential level. I say we will look smart if we do this now, but the flip side is also true. We will look like idiots if we fail to do this as one of the most exposed economies in the world. I personally would love to see Canada leading again, and CAFA would make that happen. Finally, a word about transition plans. I know the federal government is currently considering how to regulate disclosure, as noted in the recent fall economic statement, and anticipates presenting options on this. Defining and regulating credible transition plans should be a key part of this. One of my own research strands involves analyzing the credibility of banks and fund managers' climate targets and transition plans. And in that work, I find so many loopholes and evasions that I've written a paper soon to be published that includes bingo cards to help people identify the most common ones. Transition plans are not worth the paper they're printed on unless they are regulated and standardized. Currently, the quality is simply not high enough to be usable by investors. CAFA would address this issue too and is therefore likely to be imitated the world over. As I said, we are currently behind, but CAFA gives us the opportunity to leapfrog to the forefront. And in doing so, we would have a more robust framework in which to understand and prevent the systemic risks from climate change that we currently face. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to have a lively and stimulating discussion this afternoon. Last but not least, we have the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, Mr. Peter Rutledge. Could you raise the boom on your mic a bit?
And Mr. Tardif.
And Mr. Tardif as well, please, if you could raise your boom. Go ahead. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Rutledge. You're on mute.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to contribute to your study on environment and climate impacts related to the Canadian financial system. I'm joined by my colleague, Stéphane Tardif, Managing Director of OSFI's Climate Risk Division. Parliament has assigned to OSFI a mandate comprised of 2 basic principles. It asks OSFI to ensure financial institutions are in sound financial condition and to ensure they adequately protect themselves against threats to their integrity or security, including foreign interference. When institutions are at risk of falling short of these principles, we oblige management and boards of directors to take prompt corrective measures. OSFI operates a principles-based regulatory model in which we articulate broad prudential principles to which we ask financial institutions to adhere. In contrast to many global peers, we do not impose rules on regulated constituents, preferring instead to issue guidelines that articulate sound principles aimed at protecting creditors, depositors, and policyholders. We believe our principles-based model produces better institutional resilience at a lower cost to our regulated constituents. At OSFI, we see the risks posed by climate change on our regulated constituents as an emerging financial risk with uncertain and nonlinear downside costs. As economies adapt to climate change, we also recognize that financial institutions will have opportunities to fund that adaptation and profit from that activity. In pursuing our mandate, Parliament instructs OSFI to protect the rights of creditors, depositors, and policyholders, having due regard to allow financial institutions to compete and take reasonable risks. To support sound management of the financial risks posed by climate change without unduly impairing pathways to profitable investments in adaptation, OSFI has undertaken a number of initiatives to encourage financial institutions to advance their capabilities in measuring and managing climate risk. Through in-depth empirical analysis, Canadian financial institutions can become early beneficiaries of sound climate risk management. In closing, OSFI has an explicit mandate to contribute to public confidence in the Canadian financial system. This includes ensuring that the financial institutions we regulate are managing the risks that could impact their safety and soundness appropriately. Among these are the physical and transition risks associated with climate change. While OSFI does not have an explicit mandate to advance climate change objectives, our current mandate provides us with ample scope to take action to ensure the financial institutions respond to the opportunities and threats of climate change effectively. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Surintendant.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Mr. Leslie, on to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Party, in your opening remarks, you mentioned something along the lines that business leaders don't need to be told to pay attention to risk because, as any good business leader would, they are already doing that. In your assessment, is there any evidence to suggest that pension funds or financial institutions aren't paying attention to those market dynamics and market risks, and that it is important that the government institute and impose new regulations on them?
Not that I'm aware. I mean, this. I beg pardon?
I'm sorry?
I can't hear anyone.
Okay, so.
And nor can I.
Okay.
Same.
Well, we'll stop. So nobody can hear anything in either language, is what we're saying? Or is it the translation?
The floor audio is muted.
The floor audio is muted. Is it on now? Okay, let's go, Mr. Leslie. It's your turn.
Thank you. Mr. Party, in your opening remarks, you alluded to the fact that good business leaders are already paying attention to what is going on in terms of market dynamics and in terms of risk. Is there any evidence that you've found that pension funds and financial institutions aren't paying attention to that risk or those market dynamics and that the government should or needs to impose new regulations on them?
None that I'm aware of, no. I mean, the test of risk for a pension fund or a company is whether or not you're succeeding in the marketplace. If you are a pension fund and not paying attention to risk and your investments decline in value, well, then you're not doing very well. And you didn't need government regulations to demonstrate that. I think we're in danger of conflating two different kinds of risk. One is the risk to a company, and that is the risk that the company's in the business to manage. The other risk is the one that you want to impose upon them, which is the risk of global climate change. And I'm not saying that's not a risk. I'm saying you're trying to internalize it onto the companies instead of being governmental about it and establishing your own rules about it instead of trying to make them do it for you.
Do you think it's a risk when you have politicians playing around, meddling with CPP, our major pension funds, which is the biggest safety net in which Canadians rely on across this country? Is that also a risk that we should be considering, the fact that we are intentionally trying to starve out the financing of energy projects that have major implications for our country?
Yes, so you're splitting the loyalties of the pension. You're trying to say, well, you want to provide returns to the people that you're going to support in their old age, but we also want you to pay attention to something else. And that, as often as not, is going to diminish the returns you produce for those first group of people. So the best policy is a straightforward one, which is that the pension should be able to pursue the best returns available because those companies they're investing in are acting within the law. The government meddling just messes the whole thing up.
And we've heard in previous testimony that these ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed typical portfolios, more diversified strategies by more than about 250 basis points per annum over the past 5 years. And if this Liberal NDP coalition decided to impose an ESG mandate on the CPP or any other pension funds in this country, it would cost Canadians potentially tens of billions of dollars in lost income and lost security for their retirement and their futures. In your assessment, is that an accurate portrayal?
I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but let me say this. The difference that we are talking about. So I am not here to argue against a company deciding to take on certain kinds of priorities, to get certification, to adopt guidelines. I'm not suggesting that at all. As long as they decide to do that in the interest of the company, that's great. What we're talking about is the government imposing mandatory rules. You're not allowing the company to make the judgment about the risk or about the investment or about the productivity or about the profit. You are making those decisions for you. The division is between voluntary and mandatory.
We've heard in previous testimony that rather than divestment, investment is the more prudent approach, particularly given the other nations that will provide these fuel sources, energy sources, if Canada does not. Is it fair to say that this approach is actually the exact opposite? We should be investing in new clean technologies to reduce our emissions of our particular energy sources while simultaneously keeping that investment in Canada?
As I alluded to, the Canadian energy is actually a tremendous source of solutions for reducing global carbon emissions. It's not the main source of the problem. It could be a great source of the solution. But the fact that we are knee-jerk about this, and we think that we shouldn't develop anything in this country. That is not what other countries are doing. Other countries who have natural resources are digging up lots and lots of coal in China and India. I'm sure you've been told this. And they produce, China in particular, China is far and away, the largest carbon producer on the planet. And their obligations under the Paris Agreement are essentially non-existent. If we exported natural gas to China, the bang for the buck would be far greater than any of the provisions that you are contemplating putting in place.
A number of years ago, there was a Supreme Court decision that stated, directors owe a fiduciary duty to the corporation and only to the corporation, end quote. Could a government-imposed ESG mandate on private companies actually conflict with their fiduciary duties?
Absolutely, of course, yes. And what you get is split loyalties, as I alluded to earlier. So the way that investors are protected in our economy is that the directors and officers, as you allude to, owe a fiduciary duty to the corporation. And what the courts have said is that that fiduciary duty means that they must try to maximize the profit of the company for the sake of the shareholders.
Thank you.
And if instead the government mandates a split loyalty and makes those directors and officers serve another master, then the fortunes of those investors will decline.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Pardee, I have a couple of quotes that are attributed to you here. I quote, "There is no rationale for Canada to have any emissions reductions targets of any kind." Another quote, "Anthropogenic climate change theory is like a zombie. It won't die no matter the evidence." Are those your quotes?
No, I don't recall the second one, but the first one definitely so, yes.
Okay, so do you believe that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions from human activities?
So I'm not a scientist, sir. I'm a lawyer.
Good. That was actually my next question.
So I am not here to debate science.
Okay, good.
The science of climate with you.
I'm glad. That was my next question.
Hold on.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, fair enough.
My next question was whether or not you had any academic training in climatology or environmental science, and you answered that question gratefully. We have many experts here, so I'll go over to Dr. Ellen Quigley. Dr. Ellen Quigley, do you believe that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions from human activities?
It's not a belief, it's an established scientific fact.
Thank you very much. I agree with that, and I appreciate that. So we have a lot of work to do in Canada, as you very rightly pointed out. Dr. Quigley, do you believe that greenhouse gas emissions should be measured by flag or per capita or by GDP when we're looking at how a country is performing in terms of their emissions reductions targets?
That was exactly my thought hearing about China. Our per capita emissions are significantly higher than China's, and that is a source of reputational harm to Canada as a country that is otherwise respected.
Thank you for that. And could you point to the reasons why Canada tends to have the highest per capita emissions in the world?
Well, it's in expansion mode when all of the other wealthy countries are expanding nowhere near to the same degree as we are. That the main source of growing emissions for us comes from expanding oil and gas. Even though many other countries are, of course, still extracting, the growth is nowhere near the levels that we're experiencing.
Thanks, Dr. Quigley. I recently read that the most recent year on record with respect to the production of natural gas in Canada was a record year for the production of natural gas. Yet, witnesses on this committee and others have pointed to an inability of Canada to extract things like natural gas. Do you feel that Canada has an inability to extract things like natural gas from our natural resources economy?
No, clearly Canada is very good at that, but I will just point out that the methane emissions associated with natural gas need to be incorporated into our analyses and actually can be worse than coal depending on the level of leakage of methane, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas.
Indeed it is. I remember that from grade 9 science. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, with the remaining time I have available here, I would like to table a motion, if I could. Is that all right? I have enough time? Okay, great. Maybe I'll have a little bit of time towards the end. Sorry, I closed it, so I'm just going to open it. I'm glad I have sufficient time here. Okay. I'm just tabling it, yeah. The Parliamentary Budget Officer published a short update under additional analyses on the PBO's website on the day after the 2024 federal budget. That was April 17th, 2024. It relates to their often cited report, A Distributional Analysis of Federal Carbon Pricing Under a Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. PBO staff discovered that both the fuel charge and the OBPS, that's the output-based pricing system, had been removed in the counterfactual scenario. Consequently, estimates of household net costs incorporated fiscal and economic impacts. That was published in their March 2022 and 2023 reports. They reflect the broader economic impact of federal equivalent carbon pricing. In essence, it seems that the PBO may have inadvertently exaggerated the impact that carbon pricing would have on household budgets. Despite that, their report still indicated that at least 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back with the Canada Carbon Rebate than the price on pollution costs. So I move that the committee invite the Parliamentary Budget Officer for 1 hour to discuss his recent findings on his report and how he plans to correct the record in his fall report.
So you're tabling that?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you still have some time for questions?
Okay, I'll relinquish that to the Chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Madame Posey.
Oui, alors je voudrais remercier.
Thank you to all of our witnesses. Before asking my question, I'd like to come back to what you said, Mr. Party, in your opening remarks. I have never heard so much denial about climate change, especially I was almost insulted when you identified our study and qualified it as a threat to the economic prosperity of the country. I think that I am here in a professional manner, and I, quite the opposite, am seeking to ensure that the citizens of my nation, of my riding, have a healthy environment and that their health not be risked or affected by climate change. That said, I have a question to ask Ms. Quigley. Citizens are increasingly worried by greenwashing. A report says that 78% of Canadians want a regulation about whitewashing in banks. 65% are favorable for their pension funds to be divested from fossil fuels. Is this, therefore, are they right in not trusting the voluntary disclosure of climate emissions?
I'm afraid I switched into interpretation partway because of a term I didn't understand in French, so I hope that I've gotten the right question. Look, I think that what the public is saying is that they want something that actually the evidence lines up with. So I've reviewed 118 years worth of studies looking at the costs of divestment to investment portfolios and found basically no effect. I mean, you can time it poorly or well. So certainly if that percentage of the population is in favor of this, I personally would not be concerned about the effects on financial returns depending on the timing of the divestment. Sorry, was that your question?
Ms. Quigley, the idea is rather that Canadians are mistrustful of whitewashing by oil and gas, by banks, and various companies. Are they not? Are they right in not trusting the voluntary disclosure of information? Some want a voluntary disclosure system. Should we not have something that is regulated instead?
That is an extremely important question. Yes, we see systematic underreporting when we have voluntary disclosure. In fact, academics I know looked at CDP disclosures even, and those are some of the best ones we have, and found that there were basic addition errors and so on. I mean, we can't trust the information that we get from voluntary disclosures. And frankly, referring back to the comments about costs earlier, because there's no world in which we don't have disclosure. We're increasingly required to do that because of interactions with other parts of the world that already have this. It is actually, in my view, likely to be less costly were we to have mandatory disclosure that aligns with what other countries are doing. Voluntary disclosure regimes that don't agree with one another is a really good way to run up costs and make sure that you get information that you can't trust, act on, or invest on the basis of.
Thank you for your answer. Ms. Galvez, Honorable Senator, it is notable that many board of directors have amongst their administrators people who are from the oil and gas sector. You talked about it in your opening remarks. Do you think that this is something that slows down or even impedes the implementation of regulation that we are trying to put in place? It certainly won't help. When board members are wearing multiple hats, it's very difficult to be loyal to one instead of the other. Many reports describe this very situation. In a confidential meeting, I was told that board members of oil and gas companies and banks and so on can fill a room of 500 people. So it's actually very common to see this.
Excusez-moi, vous avez raison.
Oh, I'm sorry. Very, very sorry. It's a good thing I'm keeping an eye on you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I was ahead of myself. You may continue. I'm very sorry, Madam Senator. Ms. Galvez, I would like you to finish your notes because you didn't have a chance to finish your opening remarks, and I just wanted to know what's happening elsewhere. I just wanted to say that Canada is lagging behind Europe, the United States, and even China. Every country has its own approach. China has executive orders. Europe uses another method, and the United States use a lot of inject money. And the whole idea is to go ahead to reach this goal. And Canada is just waiting to see what happens. This really hurts our competitiveness. You have time for a brief comment. I'll ask you the question. You can answer it later. What other mechanisms are implemented elsewhere to eliminate the conflict of interest on boards of directors? You can answer it later.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the second week in a row that Conservatives have brought witnesses to committee that argue against ambitious climate action. And Mr. Party published an article criticizing the Supreme Court for stating that climate change is an existential threat to Canada. He posted on the platform X, quote, "Even if you believe in anthropogenic climate change, there's no rationale for this country to have emission reduction targets of any kind." The fact that my Conservative colleague, Mr. Leslie, spent his entire questioning time giving this person space to add their testimony into our report, I think is appalling, to be honest. So I'm going to focus my questions on Senator Galvez. And can you, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you for putting forward the Climate Aligned Finance Act. It is an important piece of legislation. We have OSFI here with us, and they brought in their guidelines, B15, that require financial institutions to improve their governance and risk management practices, but it falls short of requiring them to align with Canada's climate commitments. And can you talk a little bit about why it doesn't go far enough?
I recognize and I thank OSFI for putting out this guideline, but unfortunately is the minimum. And it doesn't make us move because transparency is equivalent to a diagnostic. So it's like telling a patient, you have cancer, and then bye-bye, see you later. They have to mitigate, they have to manage, and they have to reduce the emissions. So this is the way we manage risk. So we have to control it, we have to mitigate it, and at the end, we really have to stop it. And so to stop, we have to reduce emissions. And to reduce emissions, we need the financial sector. And the financial sector needs to be aligned with our climate commitments, which is maximum 1.5 degrees, net zero 2050.
Thank you. And maybe just turning to our colleague at OSFI, can you talk a little bit about or explain why you didn't go farther to meet this important benchmark?
Thank you for the question. Parliament, as I mentioned in my opening statement, Parliament assigns us a specific mandate. Basically says ensure and contribute to public confidence in the Canadian financial system. It does not tell us to advance climate-related agenda. As a GIC appointee, I'm duty-bound to implement the instructions from Parliament, and that's it. However, our mandate does require us to ensure financial institutions remain in sound financial conditions. We put in B15, and it does do risk management and governance, but it also will oblige climate risk disclosures, scenario testing, among other features. Because of the long-term threat of climate change to the sound financial conditions of financial institutions, we put in place B15, and we intend to continue to move forward the progress of financial institutions in managing climate risk as a financial risk and a threat to their sound financial conditions.
Thanks. Maybe turning to Senator Galvez, maybe hearing that, can you talk a little bit about your response and about why the Climate Aligned Finance Act is so important?
OSFI is right. He does what its mandate tells them to do. So that's why we need a government, we need us telling him, okay, you have to take care more deeply in the questions of climate-related risk. And also, we need the expertise of climate in the modeling. So climate-related stress and modeling, it's good, but it doesn't make us attain the goal of reducing emissions. For that, we need transition plans and progress report telling us that the emissions are being reduced.
Thanks so much. And we heard from another witness here today that this kind of action would be detrimental to the Canadian economy and that other countries aren't doing this. But actually, Canada's behind 40 other countries when it comes to aligning our financial institutions with our climate commitments. Can you talk a little bit about how this actually could be a benefit to the Canadian economy?
Absolutely, because it's about opportunities. When risk is there, yes, there is a danger, but there is also the opportunities. And so when you innovate in order to mitigate the emissions, then you will create new technology. Then you will create a different economy. And, I don't need to tell you that we didn't abandon the Stone Age for lack of stones. We abandoned that age because there were better, cleaner, safer, cheaper ways of doing the same thing. And that's the idea.
Can you expand a little bit on how these kind of robust regulatory tools, legislative tools, will impact banks, pension funds, jobs, affordability?
30 seconds. In 30 seconds, please, Senator.
It will enable the Sustainable Job Act. With that money, you cannot have your Sustainable Job Act.
Yeah, we'll go now. I'm going to have to cut the time in half in the second round because we don't have permission to extend beyond a certain time. So 2.5 minutes, Mr. Mazur.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Party, you're a lawyer, correct? You mentioned that public companies already have an obligation to consider and declare risks for investors. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Of course. Sure. So there are some companies that are publicly listed on stock exchanges and people buy shares. And so, for example, if you're a company subject to the Ontario Securities Commission, they have a whole list of requirements that these public companies have to meet in terms of the disclosure, the material risks and change and so on. And if they don't do that, then they'll be in breach of those security rules. More principally, the whole idea of a business enterprise is to be responsible to the people that you that invest in you, and so that's the definition of an entrepreneur: someone who takes risk and manages it.
Thank you, Mr. Rutledge. How many megatons of emissions will be reduced in Canada by implementing OSFI's climate-related financial disclosure expectations?
When financial institutions begin to measure their counterparties for emissions, they will make pragmatic, empirically driven decisions on whether to continue to expose themselves to those institutions over time. And to the extent that institution decides to lower their exposure to emitters of greenhouse gases, then they'll pull capital. It is not our job nor our intent to measure the reduction of emissions in the broader economy by forcing disclosure. It is our job and intent to measure the risks financial institutions expose themselves so their boards and senior managers can make sound, risk-based judgments.
So you're not worried about reducing emissions? It's not one of the wanted outcomes, but okay. Mr. Rutledge, how much does it cost financial institutions to meet OSFI's climate-related financial disclosure expectations?
A very, very quick answer, please. If you have the figure. If you don't, you can send it to us.
Yeah. There was a study done for a smaller, medium-sized bank where the burden would be highest. To meet our disclosure, or rather measurement rules or requirements, it would be about 50 to 100,000. 50 to 100,000.
Can you please table that?
Yeah, could you send us something in writing on that, Mr. Rutledge?
Thank you.
There's also a study by the IMF on
we got to
compliance
keep
costs
going,
could be
Mr.
relevant.
Sorry,
Yes,
Mr.
both
Rutledge.
studies, please.
Thank you.
Madame Châtel.
We'll table both.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Rutledge, thank you for being here with us. In your view, what's the urgency of getting the taxonomy and disclosure right, and the implication if we do not have those policies in place?
Yeah. So the taxonomy and disclosure are two different pieces of the pie. The taxonomy would help us to quantify the opportunity and measure and identify the opportunity. It would help financial institutions measure and identify the opportunity for adaptation. The measurement would help financial institutions understand the extent of risk concentration they have to greenhouse gas emitting energy sources. And if they look at the evolution of the world in terms of utilization of energy, they'll be better positioned to measure their exposure and make sound risk management decisions.
Thank you very much. Many are looking at OSFI as a possible oversight authority for the proposed green and transition finance taxonomy and disclosure. What are your thoughts on this?
It's very preliminary. We're not closed to the idea. I think the idea needs to find its way to OSFI formally, and then we need to digest and understand if we're appropriate center for that. And naturally, we would defer to the Minister of Finance, who is the head of the office, superintendent being the deputy head.
Thank you. And what is OSFI's view on the most effective and timely way to ensure that we have both taxonomy and disclosure in place to be competitive in the new economy?
On the disclosure side, we're moving forward with our disclosure ask of financial institutions. Later this fall, they'll start, and they'll progress throughout the course of the next fiscal year. And we'll do larger institutions that have the capacity first, and smaller institutions will have longer to do it. That is, and we need the CSSB to finish their disclosure standards to drive that forward. But that is on a pretty good pathway. The taxonomy is very important to helping us define and uncover, or helping financial institutions define and uncover the opportunity.
I hate to interrupt, Mr. Rutledge. I'm really sorry. Madame Posey, vous avez un peu plus.
You have a bit more than a minute, Ms. Posey, very briefly. So, quickly, Senator, is there any way to not get into conflicts of interest with boards of directors? We have to improve transparency. Investors need transparency. They need credibility. They need clear signals. Thank you for the direct answer. One last question to Ms. Quigley. Double materiality has been touched on. We are sensitive to human health. Can you talk about materiality and its risks?
I think this is the most exciting part of this bill, arguably. I mean, not least because it actually captures the impacts on our real lives and economies and so on and so forth. But frankly, just to kind of refer with all due respect to Professor Party's points, we get perverse outcomes sometimes when each bank is kind of making its own decisions about risk because they are looking at the risk to the bank. The impacts from the banks in aggregate is what we really need to worry about. And that's what banking regulation is for. It's for addressing systemic risks that arise when each institution is making individually rational decisions. So the double materiality element here is the way in which we capture that systemic element.
Thank you. Ms. Collins, you have a little more than a minute.
Thanks. My question is to Ms. Quigley. First of all, thank you so much for being a voice of science and reason on this panel. You talked a little bit about greenwashing, and Canadians are concerned about this. Can you talk a bit about how mandating compliance with specific standards for climate alignment and using other tools like capital requirements could help increase public trust?
Great question. Again, yeah, it's essential. I mean, you should all be interested in this as parliamentarians because people are losing trust in our public institutions because they can't trust the information that they get and on which basis they make their decisions. And this is an increasing concern for the public. But also we are seeing, again, this is Canada's behind other places are doing this, and so that citizens of other countries can actually have greater trust in the information that they're getting from companies.
Mr. Cram, you have 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Party, you were unable earlier to respond fully to a question from Mr. Van Couverton, and Ms. Collins made a statement about one of your Twitter posts that you didn't have the opportunity to respond to. Would you care to take a minute to say what you would have said in response?
Yes, thank you very much. So my analysis assumes that everything that Mr. Vancouverton would say about climate change is true. It accepts the proposition that there is anthropomorphic climate change and that the situation is as has been widely suggested. I'm not suggesting anything to the contrary. The point is this, that if we think that that is true, if this is really an emergency, and if the planet is actually burning, then the things that you are suggesting are wholly inadequate, which means that maybe that you don't believe it yourselves. So here's an analogy. If there's a burning house, your house is burning down, and you've got no fire department, you've got no hose, you've got no water, until you grab your neighbor's cup of coffee and you throw it on the fire because it's wet. And you say, well, we're doing something about it. No, you're not. And you're doing nothing about it. All of these will have no effect because Canada is not the source of carbon emissions. Yeah, 1.5%. But as I alluded to earlier, the main source of carbon emissions are other countries with big populations and lots of coal and no restrictions in international regimes like the Paris Agreement. So if you're serious about this, then you need to find a different path to find an actual solution to the actual problem you're claiming exists.
That we could increase Canadian prosperity and decrease global emissions by increasing natural gas exports to Asia and increasing Canadian exports of nuclear technology. Could you elaborate on how that would be beneficial?
I'm afraid there's only 15 seconds to elaborate.
Both those things would displace other activities that would produce more carbon emissions.
Thank you. Mr. Ali, for 2.5 minutes. Is Mr. Ali online? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Mr. Rutledge. In what ways does climate change impact the financial system that governments are not accounting for?
There are two parts of climate change. There's physical risk and there is transition risk. Physical risk, through the insurance industry, we have a sense of what the increase in catastrophes, the costs of the catastrophes are as a result of climate change. And Insurance Bureau of Canada does great work on that. Where we are less certain is on what the impact of transition risk might be, the impact of stranded assets if they were ever to arrive. The purpose for our climate risk returns is to begin to empirically measure what that risk is so boards of directors can make informed decisions. That's the gap we're trying to close through Guideline B15.
Thank you. Are there additional steps that OSFI is considering to improve rules requiring disclosure of risks related to climate change?
Our first priority is getting the measurement right. Getting to Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions isn't easy. It's hard. It has implications downstream for their clients. At the appropriate time, we can oblige banks to disclose. And indeed, if you read our current rule, we do oblige banks to disclose. Even if we didn't have it, bank shareholders and creditors are demanding that, and that is why I think we haven't heard too much complaints from the industry that we regulate about our disclosure requirements outlined in Guideline B15.
Thank you. As you know, climate finance policies have implications for both investors and insurers. To what extent do you believe Canada should be aligned with other nations in implementing measures to support sustainable finance?
The way I think of that question is I serve as superintendent for a banking system and a financial system that takes in capital from outside the country to invest in it. The people who provide the institutions that capital look to Canada's standards, including our standards on climate risk. One of the reasons we have focused on B15 is to show those investors we take it seriously and our institutions have policies and procedures in place to manage it effectively.
Excellent. Je tiens à remercier tous les...
Fantastic. Thank you to all of the witnesses That was a very lively discussion, just as we'd thought it would be. Thank you very much for your availabilities, and we will stop there. And to all the members of the committee, have a good weekend.